So, hi everyone, and welcome back to Blame It on Marketing. We're joined by a very special guest today, who I will let introduce himself in a minute. But today's topic, we are talking about shaking the PPC money tree, something that we've all kind of heard. If you've ever worked at a startup in particular, sometimes people think that you just turn on the PPC tap and the leads and the money comes in. So that is today's topic. But before we get into that, Jonathan, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me on. So I'm Jonathan, one of the co-founders of Omni Lab. We're a demand gen agency, and we work specifically with B2B SaaS companies, predominantly on trying to figure out ways we can drive pipeline and not just leads. To your point about, the endless lead tap that we're always trying to get to flow out as many leads as possible. And so we do that a lot for those companies, mostly in the US, but we also work for some companies in the UK actually, and then broader Europe.
Wonderful. So, Jonathan, where do you think the notion of, especially with founders and I guess senior leaders, that you can just turn on the PPC tab and there'll be instant leads and instant pipeline and everything will be okay comes from?
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. Oh man, I was really hoping it would. Yeah, I think it comes from, there's a psychological bias that I'm sure you guys have probably heard called hyperbolic discounting. And I think it comes from this like instant gratification of wanting to get it now. And so we're so used to Amazon and Instagram and fast internet and whatnot, or at least hopefully, maybe not you, Em. I know you're struggling with some internet, but we're used to this kind of, motion of how things are moving. And so when we don't get things exactly when we want it, as soon as we start spending on PPC or paid ads on whatever channel, then I think that gets aggravating. And I think the other thing too about it is that you've got marketers trying to also navigate the battle of how do we sell executives on longer term brand programs that are not going to convert today. And so that creates a very difficult discussion that I think we're going to get back into in a couple of questions down the road here, but it's a balance, right? And so you can't as a marketer just say, "Hey, hang tight, it'll be fine. The revenue is going to come at some point, and we just sit," because it's about being consistent, being there in front of them, and then when they're ready, they're going to come in and buy. And like that message makes sense, and a lot of people say that, but to a founder, to a CEO, we need to also keep in mind some of those short-term goals. And so like a practical example of this is a lot of things that we'll do immediately when we get working with a client is really make sure that if there's existing demand already for what they do, let's go out and make sure their Google Ads account is optimized towards revenue, that we've got the key keywords that are focused on pipeline and driving good opportunities for them, as much money going into those as possible, and then the keywords that are not leading to pipeline, that we get rid of those for now. And there's probably additional search impression share that we can increase, and so that allows us to say, okay, great, let's make sure that we can hit some of those short-term goals, and then we can sell that up to get more budget to do some of the longer-term programs. So I'll stop myself there and see what you guys think, but that's a quick take.
Have you had moments where I assume people come to you and they want you to manage their PPC and that kind of thing, and that's kind of what the founder's expectations is. It's, oh, we've just got some funding, we need to turn the PPC on, and like it's all gonna work out. What's your reaction to that?
I mean, I get it. It's because they're under immense amount of pressure, and when you're looking at the runway, which average runway for a SaaS company is around 18 months if you're lucky, some much lower than that, and so there's definitely a lot of stress coming from the board, investors, and other people to drive results, and of course that founder wants to be successful. So I totally get it. I think it's just about figuring out how to measure each type of campaign and where you decide to spend money. And so again, back to kind of the point about Google Ads, if there is existing demand and you're not a new category creator, which is a dangerous thing to do anyway for most SaaS companies because they don't have the resources to do that, then the easiest place to start is on that, or review sites is another one. There's some other using intent data, for example, to do account prioritization with the sales team. And so to figure out, all right, how do we make sure that that CEO and founder that needs results right now today, how do we focus on some of the things where there's already people that are problem aware, there's already people looking for exactly what this brand does, and try to make sure they know who your brand is, your company is, so ultimately they can come in and convert. And so I think that that's the alignment that I usually try to make sure is really solid from the get-go, or that anyone should for any client. And then again, you get into your kind of longer term stuff because direct response and non-direct response can't be measured the same way. And I think that's the other thing that people make mistakes on is, because CEOs typically are not coming from a marketing background. That's not true for all, but true for many, is that we kind of put everything in the bucket of like dollar in, dollar out. right? I'm going to give you $1, you're going to give me $3 back. And it just seems nice and easy math. And we get out our spreadsheet and we make a nice little waterfall funnel that's easy to create, where you say ad spend in, click CPC, leads, pipeline revenue, so on and so forth. But unfortunately, there's some campaigns that just don't work in that model. They just don't. And so if you're not okay with that, then the alignment from the beginning is saying, all right, we're not going to run those right now. We're not ready for that. Let's just prove out that we can capture some of the existing demand in the market. And then once we're ready, then we can add in some of the other stuff. So,
Speaking of dollars in, dollars out, so I have a number in my head that I think is good for B2B PPC, and I wonder if it's the same as yours. So I'll tell you, and you can tell me if I'm completely wrong. So for me, PPC over like long term, so I'd say measuring over 6 to 12 months, if you can pay for it, fantastic. So if it's $1 in, $1 out, great for, like B2B longer sales cycle stuff. And if it's like anything from 0.7 to 1 in terms of ROI, so from just about not paying for it to paying for it, I think it should be definitely kept on. I don't know, like, is that a wild number? Now I'm curious for myself.
I think the way that I think about it is more CAC payback is usually the biggest metric. I mean, usually CAC itself.
Given that companies have good renewals is my numbers.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, and I think you guys probably know the benchmark all too well, right? I mean, anything under usually 14, 12 months, somewhere around there, because again, the longer time it takes to recoup that initial money in terms of acquisition, ultimately the more money you're going to need to raise. And especially in the economic climate we're in right now with high interest rates, high inflation. I know that that's also been true generally for Europe. I know certainly more of the US and the European side, but I think those things are realities that everyone's facing right now, especially in the US. We're clamping down on budgets. We're trying to figure out how to increase runway because we don't want to have to go for that raise right now because we might have to give up a lot more equity and or take on debt, which would be paying higher interest rates. And so there's just some concerns around that. So yeah, I think CAC payback's usually the way that we think about it. But ultimately these numbers, it's going to be whatever's comfortable for that specific brand. And, those numbers should take into consideration like ACV and all the other typical things, margins, whatnot, and just about what they're comfortable with.
Very good advice there for the founders. I think, so some of the common mistakes and some of the stuff that I think Ruta and I have seen is when you come in and you're the marketer, and especially when you first join an organization and you're setting things up and, everybody says, what's the first thing you want to do? And we all want to turn the PPC on. We all want some budget to go towards that. We understand that there's payback eventually. But what do you think are some of the mistakes marketers make in defense of PPC?
And many times they even say a lot of times it's the website, right? It's like the first 60 days, everyone wants to build a website, right? And they want to, get something new. We're going to rebrand room. We need to replatform. Our messaging sucks. Let's redo all of that, right? It's funny. I was just seeing a post on LinkedIn about this just a second ago of someone doing exactly this and saying, I'm breaking the best practices of actually building a website, even though everyone does that. But yeah, to answer your question, the big thing is really an obsession over optimizing just for the lowest cost per lead or leads. And so, again, back to the point on Google Ads, or we can use another example is, a lot of times when you're just a marketer inside the ad channel, you have a very small view of actually what's happening. And so, or narrow view of what's happening. And so a lot of times you end up saying, great, we're winning because leads are up and CPL is down and this is great and everything's happy, when really on the back end we could have a bigger problem that's brewing where sales isn't happy with the lead quality, they're not really ready for sales outreach, and a number of other things. And so I think that that's a big one that I think a lot of marketers get themselves into some issues with in terms of just general management of PPC. The other thing is, trying to get out of the single sourcing mindset too. And so a lot of times people will walk in and say, this lead came from LinkedIn, this lead came from Google Ads, this lead came from whatever. And I'm not saying we shouldn't measure the effectiveness of each channel, but in B2B, the reality for most, and I'm talking about more like Series A, Series B that have a multi-channel type of motion, the reality is that people are seeing across multiple different channels. And so the celebration and driving up reports and results to the CEO saying, hey, this is the one channel that did it, I think it's making it too simple. It's not that simple, and we all want it to be, right. I mean, that would be easier, right, if it just was like, nope, they saw it here. That was the only touch point they had in the entire buyer journey, and I guess we should spend a whole bunch more money here. I mean, that would be an easier world. Now, I think that probably works and is true for really early stage companies that maybe are live only on one channel, maybe organically or paid. And so then you can really start to say, and sure, there's probably some stuff like dark social and word of mouth and all sorts of other things going on, but you could probably say, okay, we're pretty confident that this channel is working. But as soon as you get in the multi-channel environment, you need to start looking things more holistically and looking at the full buyer journey. And so there's some tools that can do that, or you can set up things in your HubSpot Salesforce to track this type of stuff. So those are two things that stand out.
Emma and I talk a lot about people turning stuff off without realizing how it affects the other channels. So it's kind of like almost like if you're judging how well your PPC is doing and you turn it off, there's a chance that it'll actually affect a bunch of your other converting channels. So seeing the touch points and making sure that you actually know what's happening, because a lot of the time people will be seeing your stuff, but they're already a contact in your CRM on some other attribution. So just being super mindful of that before you axe anything, I think is really important.
Yeah. Well, you only have to look at that Gartner B2B buying diagram that does show. I was trying to track down, because we did a previous episode where we were talking about needing 42 touch points, and I went on a bit of a mission to be like, where did that come from? And it's that Gartner buying diagram, which shows all of the touch points that someone goes through when they're buying. And obviously I think lots of people look at that and they go, yeah, that's not us though, because this is really easy to buy. You can maybe even go on our website and put your credit card details in and buy. But it's like there's all that stuff that happens before that goes on. It's like the website in particular, PPC, it's not the start and the end. It's like, no, that's just like one element. How many times did someone do something else before they did that, sort of like final stage of actually letting you know that they're interested in what you're selling. And it's really hard as a marketer, I think, to be able to communicate that to your your senior leadership, to actually say, we need to try and cover off as many of these touch points as possible. So you kind of have to trust me that we're going to need to do as many of these different things as possible, but in a kind of like unified way, and then to be able to track that and actually communicate back that that's actually working is a hell of a job, especially when you're like a one woman band, right? So that is quite difficult, but I think it's about being honest and communicating properly with each other. We've talked a lot about this, haven't we, Ruta? It's like, know what the metrics are that you're going to measure up front. Make sure you have goals that are aligned with sales, so that and it just goes back to all that kind of basic stuff. And if you do that, then you can take a more holistic approach to marketing without being worried like exactly where every single lead came from. Because then we do find ourselves in trouble, don't we?
I think you're totally right. A good question that's actually a really good gut check that I sometimes use with CEOs, founders, or even marketers sometimes, believe it or not, is if you just ask them like, first of all, have you bought, enterprise B2B software recently or ever? And then the question is, if they say yes, and it's like, okay, well, walk me through what you did before you actually bought that piece of product, software, whatever it may be. And they're not going to remember everything. That's not the test, right? No one remembers everything. They're going to remember a handful of things, but it's always more than one, right? There's always a handful of things that they mention. And so then you start getting them to think like the buyer would once you put themselves in. She's like, oh yeah, you're right. I guess I wouldn't just buy a $10,000 to $50,000 product off of one LinkedIn ad. Like, that's probably not realistic. There were probably some other things that happened, Maybe there was sales outreach, there was a LinkedIn ad, there was a webinar they went to. Maybe they didn't even click on an ad. They just saw it in channel, consumed a video. They thought it was interesting. There's a whole bunch of other things that could happen, or just, following organic content from personal profiles from the company. And so there's all these things that, people need to think about. And so once you start realizing that and you get them thinking, they're like, okay, wow, I get it. Now they're still not going to, most people still don't like that, right? Because they still want the easy math. But at least you can help the conversation forward for marketers to say, okay, good. Like, now at least we're on the same page. We know it's not realistic for us to say this one thing came from over here. We can say, hey, this one thing had influence along with these other channels. And therefore, because we see that many deals are saying, these different touch points, we should be investing more in them. What do you guys think?
We're like, yeah, there's not much more to add to that one. I think obviously we talked about marketing being holistic there, and that is vital. And also Ruta and I also talk quite a lot about how sometimes that conversation is actually better left to the marketing team. You know, the fact that we are looking at each channel performance, but I'm not going to communicate to my senior leadership team necessarily specific channel performance, because then we do get into that messy granular like detail about stuff. So, you know, that's something we've talked about quite a bit. But if you don't have the epic budget of some of the B2B SaaS companies, because lots of people listening don't work in SaaS companies, that, you know, they're but mainly B2B, what are some of the things that you should do if you haven't got that huge budget to make sure that you can, you know, have that like holistic approach to marketing?
I think the biggest thing, and this is honestly a challenge, I talk to a lot of product marketers about this all the time, and they resonate with the same type of thing. But, you know, it's really ruthless focus and prioritization on what you actually spend your money on. And so I think, you know, in Google Ads world, there might be 1,000 keywords you could go after, but there's probably really only 5 to 10 that you should only honestly be live on, and you can always expand into them. And so there's things like that. There's the age-old problem of a founder selling their TAM to investors, the billion-dollar opportunity. They get excited about that because they're the investor, right? They want a good return on their money. But then they go out and they start marketing to their TAM, everyone. So we do it all in all segments, all industries, and you know, from 100 employees to 10,000 is roughly where we are. I mean, it's such a broad range, right? And so I think it is difficult, I'll agree, in the beginning when you're early stage, because if you're in the seed stage or even Series A to a degree, sometimes you still don't really have an exact feel for the best ICP. You still don't have probably LTV and CAC figured out really well. And so there are some challenges, no doubt. But the best example is like, and it's going to sound ridiculous, but if you were cleaning a wall, right, and you had a hose, and I didn't put my finger on the hose at all, and I was just trying to hose it down, right, to clean it off, I'd probably clean the wall off okay, right? But a lot of that, you know, dirt, the stuff that's been there for years and built up, is probably not going to come off. Whereas if I took a power washer and put it on a specific portion of that wall with high water pressure, all of a sudden I start making impact. That wall starts getting cleaner and I can see it in a specific area. And so if the wall represents your whole TAM, and then the one segment that we're focusing on with that power washer represents your ICP, that's where people really need to focus, because then it gives you kind of a better idea. And so with small budgets, and you can say, instead of focusing on 1,000 accounts or 10,000 accounts, you can focus on 500, 100, 50, whatever the number is based on ACV and goals and other things like that, clearly. And so to me, that's probably the number one thing that we could all do more of, is just focus our time on less keywords, less people, because then also too, you get the benefits of, all right, great. Now that we've segmented down our ICP, we can focus on this one specific message, this one specific piece of content, these things that are going to resonate a lot better than saying like, we're the everything app for everyone. It's like, okay, like, I don't know if that's for me, and like your case studies are for companies like Amazon, and I'm not Amazon, but you're saying that you work with Amazon. I guess that's supposed to impress me, but they're not like me at all, and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest one for me. Be curious what you guys say too, if you guys have a different thought.
There's no other acronym in marketing that makes me feel as just icky and sick inside as TAM. Just, can we just dump it? Can we just have something that's actually reasonable and that's actually representative of what the fuck we're going to do? Because, oh my God, I'm sure we all have TAM stories. That's just, yeah, the first thing that was like in my mind. I was like, oh, TAM. But yeah, you're right there when it comes to the focus. Emma and I, again, probably harp on about this way more than anyone should. And it's, pick something that you do for someone. If you do everything for everyone, that's fantastic, and that could be the truth. But marketing that is so difficult. And then if you marry that with a limited resource capacity, like whether it's people or budget, it just becomes even worse. It's like it's a multiplier of that problem. And, you know, a lot of founders love the fact that they can do everything for anyone, and it makes a huge TAM. But to me, that's personally a red flag. Like if let's say if I was taking on a project or interviewing with a company and they wanted to market everything to everyone and they didn't want to niche down and understand that they have to focus on something, it's a no-go for me. So I totally agree on that.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you guys. I mean, yeah, Ruta's right. As soon as we hear the word TAM, we're both like deeply triggered, I think. Yeah, it's not a good thing to be everything to everyone ever, I don't think. I think if you just think about, even the way when you buy from B2C, I buy running trainers because I want to go running. I don't buy running trainers because I want to like sit in my house wearing them because they look cool. Like, it's the specifics. It matters. Like, that's maybe a bad example, but it's the specifics. Yeah, it's still products, right? It's products, and it's the specifics of how you use and why you use and why the person buys the product and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah, and it's never a good thing to be like, we could just sell this to everyone. And I even think, especially when you've not got much budget, it's even worse for all of those reasons that we've just talked about, I think. And then it comes back down into like content production, because then it's like, well, how can you focus any marketing campaigns or content on anything if you're trying to be everything to everyone? Your content just doesn't land with anybody. Then it's like, oh, but we have one audience. Yeah, you're one audience that works in like 100 different industries and sectors and are different size organizations.
You know what happens then though, right? You know what happens when that's the case? Oh, let's just do brand stuff. Let's just talk about how beautiful our brand is, and let's just put up our logo everywhere and random fucking quotes that mean nothing to anyone anywhere. Because again, seen this too many times if you can't tell that I'm not triggered or that I am triggered.
Crazy. Well, I think the other thing too is like the common thing that people love to do is they love to compare themselves to a company that's 10 to 100 times their size, right? And they say, well, look what they're doing. We want to do something like that. And so people love to talk about Salesforce because Salesforce has been clearly successful, right? And they love to say, but look what they're doing. They're doing all these things and they're doing this. And it's like, but you're not Salesforce. You don't have the budget. You don't have the resources that they do. They have, I don't even know how many products now through acquisition. I mean, probably 50 plus now. And so it's not the same. And so you can't compare yourself to those companies. And frankly, many times Salesforce may have a product that's even going after a current segment you're going after. And that's exactly how you win, is because Salesforce has such a massive budget. They've got to spread it over all these different segments because they've got big goals to hit. And you've got this small little budget. It's the only way for you to make an impact and even compete if you had a product that was maybe similar as one feature product of Salesforce, is for you to put all your weight and energy in that one segment, because you're probably going to be able to outperform them because you can put literally all your weight, messaging, content, you name it, to that one segment and be known for that specific thing, whether it's law firms or whoever you're marketing to. And I think that's the other thing that drives me nuts is as soon as those big comparisons come up and you're like, yeah, but you're not them. I mean, maybe at some point, I like it. We can dream. We can build a plan maybe to get there. But right now we're...
It's not the fake it till you make it instance in this point. I think you can't quite do that, especially if you're paying good money for PPC. Don't try to fake it till you make it, because you're gonna run out of money.
Well, that's when you end up wasting loads of money, right? That's it. Bye budget.
And then you turn off the campaigns. Bye budget. Yeah, absolutely. So I think a lot of marketers are kind of very understanding to what we're talking about, right? Like, they know it's not how it works, or maybe they don't, and now they will, which is great. But I think a lot of what we're talking about is setting expectations with more so, senior leaders, CEOs, founders. So what are some of the ways that we can do that to make sure that PPC gets the right, I guess, setup from the beginning, but also that it gets the right chance to perform and actually do something for the company?
Yeah, I think you said it. It's expectations at the beginning. And one thing I've always said is not all campaigns and programs can be measured the same way. They cannot. There are big differences between a direct response Google Ads campaign where you're sending traffic to a PPC landing page to get a demo or sign up for a trial, than having a cold campaign on LinkedIn targeting people that have never heard of your brand before. They're very different. So I think the big thing is just outlining, like, maybe not to the granularity to the CEO, especially like, here's our 20 campaigns. That would be too much, but more bucketing them into even just brand awareness and lead gen. That would be an easy way, and just keep it nice and simple and say, all right, we're going to allocate this percent of budget to this percent of budget to this. Here are the specific metrics we're going to measure. Here's where that data lives too, is really important, right? So we're all reading the same sheet of music. Commonly, as you guys probably know, this happens all the time with us, but someone goes off and builds a report on their own, and they start adding all these filters and all sorts of different things, and we've got our report, and they're like, well, our data says blah, 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 blah. It's different than yours, and yours says XYZ. I'm like, well, let me see your report. And they're clearly different. And so it's so, so important that we make sure that we've got literally the same report, same dashboard, all the way up to the CEO. Everyone's looking at the same data, so we don't have these discrepancies. There's certainly lots of different ways to look at the data, as you guys all know. I mean, there's, I don't know how many different attribution models now, but tons of different ways to attribute performance. There's different ways to slice up the data, different ways to look at it, different time frames, all sorts of things. And so it's important to do those things, but not if we're going to be on completely different sheets of music. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is just getting a line. And that's as easy as just literally laying it out. I mean, I should create a template maybe on LinkedIn that would help some people do this exact thing, because it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. In fact, it should be simple, because the simpler it is, the easier it will be to communicate that as well as to follow it. And so, yeah, that's probably one of the biggest things. I'll stop there, let you guys kind of chime in.
Yeah, if you do create something like that, let us know, and we'll put that into the show notes, because I'm sure it'd be useful to quite a few people. For me, also, before you do any PPC, and this is such a basic bitch point, but please make sure you have a way to measure things. It, again, doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to have crazy attribution systems or softwares, but just make sure you can see what something is doing. Because again, I've seen PPC experts set up campaigns for websites that, one, have nowhere to convert on the website, which is just a whole other hilarious thing. But two, they have no way of measuring anything on the website, because it's literally like a Wix website plugged into, like, with ads going to it. So yeah, I know that sounds super basic, but just make sure you.
Oh, I mean, that's a good point. And I'll rudely interrupt you and say I totally agree, because the thing that we always see is usually conversion tracking is not set up right within the actual ad channel. People are sending click data back and all sorts of things that make no sense. And so the first thing is like getting Google Tag Manager onto the back of your website, loading up tags, triggers, variables properly, making sure that they're firing correctly. And if any new forms are added that we're tracking those, that happens a lot too, right? Website team doesn't talk to the paid team. Then you're sending traffic to pages of which there's no conversion action set up. And then, oh no, we're not sending that data back to the channel, so the channel then can't optimize, and so on and so forth. It goes down a really bad hole. But yeah, to your point, I mean, one thing we do too, and you can do this in Salesforce, we do it a lot. We've got a lot of clients on HubSpot, but we'll basically make a basic multi-touch attribution workflow. And all it is it's using latest source predominantly and original source within HubSpot, so that we can understand, hey, for the various touches, was paid part of the journey? And that's the only question we're trying to ask. And we create that dashboard shared with our client. We basically got two views. We got one on the right side that is all inbound metrics. That's regardless of source, right? So it's leads, pipeline, revenue, number of ops, and we've got some other reports that are a little bit customized. And then on the left side, it's all paid. So the stuff that we can at least attribute back and measure, we always align and tell our clients, hey, listen, like, not all of this is going to be measurable, right? There's some stuff we're going to have to measure in different ways, through correlations or through self-reported attribution or through gong call data, or the sales reps just asking people how they heard about you, and all sorts of other things like that to really understand. But yeah, I just wanted to add that point to what you said about conversion tracking, because it is incredibly important.
The only thing that I would add on top of once you've done those things is, and again, something that we all talk about probably loads, is to run some really short and sweet experiments that are really focused to see if it works. So don't like commit yourself and be like, we've set up these ads, this is what we're going with now, and it's like do or die. It's like, no, that's dangerous. I've seen that quite heavily on the agency side, actually. Sorry, we do love agencies, obviously, but that does tend to be especially when you don't have a very big budget, it's definitely like, we've set up some ads, we will optimize them every so often, but we've kind of switched them on now, and that's that. Don't do that. Like, run those short-term experiments with a really controlled budget, with really defined metrics, with really specific content to a really specific audience group, and do that first. And then you can expand, increase your budget, all those things. But also, as we've said, just make sure you can track it all as well.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think that is important. And a lot of times too, making that spreadsheet where you are aligning with the core business goals of the client and trying to at least paint the picture of a good, better, best scenario is something we do a lot too. Now, again, it's much harder in the brand awareness, reach plays where you're looking at different leading indicators. But in your direct response campaigns where you're capturing demand right now, really important just to say, okay, cool. You said your goal was $1 million for this quarter, right? So we want to go ahead and make sure that we can align with that goal, and maybe paid historically is brought in attributable 30% of that goal. And so then we could say, okay, great. Now we know it's $300,000 for the quarter, and then back into some numbers, at least that makes some sense. And we know it's not predictive. It's just spreadsheet math, and we're going to see what it looks like once we get into the channel. But that way, going back to our conversation on aligning with the metrics that senior leadership is looking at, that's how we really paint the picture and say, hey, wait a minute, like this is how we're impacting the bottom line. And here's how we're going to measure it. Back to our point on not all campaigns are measured the same way. And so we'll have the brand awareness, non-direct response campaigns into something different, right? We'll look at other things like engagement rate and CTR and impressions and things like how many companies are engaged with our brand that maybe weren't before, which is a lot more interesting than just saying CTR is up and CTR is down. Or your point, Emma, things on messaging too, and doing messaging testing early on, because a lot of times founders want to know like, hey, what's the message that's resonating better than others? Which one should we double down on? Well, how should we think about maybe changing our email copy or our website? And so paid, I wouldn't say is the greatest, channel to do, scaled message testing on because it's expensive, but it's certainly one way. And so you can pass that data back, and then maybe that's influential for the product marketing team to say, hey, wait a minute, we should actually rethink this. This is already resonating. So yeah, good points.
Yeah. Paid can be expensive to do message testing on, but I just recently did a little testing to new geographies, locations, don't know how to put that. And we were just looking at, it was on LinkedIn, we were just looking at click-through rate essentially, and comparing it to our normal click-through rate on LinkedIn to see if the same messaging worked or didn't work in those geographies. And we spent like $200, got like 600 clicks, and could basically tell whether it's worth going down that road. So sometimes it does work, but again, our goal was to see if the message resonates, which is literally are people clicking on the thing. We're then not expecting for them to like go and convert and do all of that stuff. But yeah, it can be quite fun too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing with message testing is that you need to have some normalized buckets. And I think too often what happens is there's this, throw shit at the wall kind of experience that, SaaS companies will put an agency or even in-house team into. And it's like, just go figure out what works, Emma. Go figure out what works. I don't know. We don't know. Go test some stuff out. That's so dangerous. It's not a good idea. We need to make sure that we have, number one, the narrative solidified on exactly what the narrative is of the whole company, right? Like problem, what that problem leads to, the big movement, solution, etc. And then we need to have some messaging themes. And those are the normalized buckets of things that we want to communicate to our audience. The testing occurs underneath those themes. And so that's where you say, okay, great. We know we generally want to say these three things, and three is arbitrary, right? It could be more if you've got different segments, multiple products. Obviously, this starts duplicating, but to keep it really simple, it's like, what are the three big things we want to say that align to our narrative? And then that's when the copywriters come in to figure out how we're going to say that message. And then you can go into testing on headlines and all sorts of other fun stuff. But I would spend most of my time on just pure headline testing, stop with the CTAs and the colors and all that. It's just stuff that doesn't really move the needle as much of versus actual messages. And then you can say, okay, cool. We know that, out of the 5 ads or 10 ads or however many ads you're running for the specific message bucket, this one ends up resonating more, or you might find that one theme is resonating better than another. And so those are really important insights where maybe you decide to double down on that. The other thing, last point I'd say about message testing too, is that the themes itself really shouldn't change a lot quarter to quarter. I mean, you should, or let me say week to week or month to month. Like the theme itself should stay pretty consistent, because if you go in with a different message every week, right, with a different ad, the market starts getting confused about what you actually do and what you are. And so that's why it's so important that the narrative and the theme stays consistent. Now, clearly markets mature, products evolve, and so at some point those messaging themes will need to be updated, right? You need to either reposition yourself or change the kind of the core message you're trying to communicate to the market. And that's the point when you change those things. And so I think that's the thing that most people get wrong, and it's just not organized enough because product marketing, unfortunately, is underinvested in. And I say that as a paid person that's not doing product marketing, but I think everyone needs more help on the product marketing side, especially when you're early stage.
So we touched on this a little bit, but I think it's worth covering off in its own little question segment. Is that what it's called? I don't know. What are some of the key metrics to make sure that you can measure to ensure that PPC campaigns are successful, or if they're not successful, that you can learn from them?
This has been kind of like the consistent theme in our conversation, but it's first separating, direct response from brand awareness. And so brand awareness, we're going to look at more leading indicators. And so the core things always are some of the things I mentioned before. We're looking at reach, frequency, click-through rate, engagement rate, companies engaged that weren't engaged previously, things like that. And so those aren't the fun metrics to report up to a CEO. And so we need to be careful about that. However, companies engaged, these companies being perfect ICP fits, like we talked about earlier, and reporting that out, that is interesting. Or this messaging theme is resonating a little bit more than this one. Those things are interesting. The CTR, the reach frequency, they may not even know what that means. And so those are the things you might keep kind of in your back pocket and know as a marketer, hey, I know these are important. They're trending in the right direction. We are doing a good job, but I know I need to say something different to leadership. And so there's those types of campaigns. And then clearly on your direct response campaigns, when you're capturing demand, people that are already problem aware, that are looking for what you do, it's always pipeline of revenue. I mean, clearly there's metrics all the way down to the bottom, right? Or top, bottom, depending on the way you want to think about it, right? Clicks, impressions. You need all those things ultimately to get to revenue. But in the direct response side, you really need to make sure that everything's focused on that. And like I said, with the Google Ads example, what we'll do is we'll sync up offline conversions from either Salesforce or HubSpot directly to the channel. So we know either what's producing SQLs or opportunities, depending on how many data points are coming in. And then we can say, all right, let's double down on the keywords that are producing the most pipeline and then tie that back to business goals up at the top. And so that's kind of the way that we look at it, but ultimately it just comes back to making sure that we've got the right metrics measuring for the right types of campaigns. Yeah, of course, like even your brand awareness stuff, like everything should lead to revenue, right? We're not doing any activity, whether it be a podcast or a newsletter or a this or a that, right? All these things are awareness or nurturing channels or this or that, right? So like we always expect those things too, but like trying to go back and say, for the podcast episode 28, how much revenue did that drive? I mean, it's just crazy. It's stupid, so those are my thoughts. What do you guys think? Any difference opinion, disagree, agree?
Agree. Definitely agree. I think that really clear separation actually of the different metrics depending on what it is that you're trying to achieve is really important. And then making sure that, your senior leadership always kind of maybe understand not just PPC, but some of your marketing activity in those buckets, and then making sure that you've got those metrics across other channels. And that's the language that you use to communicate is really, really important so that it doesn't get confusing or overwhelming, because we know that there are about 1 million different metrics that we could all measure and talk about. And because it's raining and it's Tuesday, we might decide to talk about something else. So I think, just being really clear on that, I think is really important so that they get it. And then also they'll be on board. So when you're saying, we actually need to spend a bit more on brand awareness because we can see this, and this, they'll be on board rather than just going, oh, that's not revenue, so therefore we're not interested. So I think, just communicating clearly, it's so important.
Yeah. The only other thing I would add to the key metrics part is looking at is it called empirical data? It's called empirical data, right? I have an economics degree, I should know this. So data that isn't necessarily maybe recorded in HubSpot, as in like they clicked on this thing or they did whatever. It's getting feedback from salespeople and listening to those calls or being able to extract that data somehow, because there can be some really great stuff in there. And also the even, stupid things like what we all should be doing, which is self-attribution, because self-attribution can be incorrect by nature because you're relying on somebody's memory to tell you where they came from. But if they keep saying Google or LinkedIn, you know something right is happening, because chances are if you're spending on those channels, they probably don't mean just organic or just off organic posts or organic search. So looking at data that's kind of a little bit ickier and less accurate and harder to grasp, but I think that taking the effort to do that, there can be some really incredible insights in there. So just not forgetting about that. And that's also specifically and especially important is if you're starting or if you're changing what you're doing. So tracking those things, because they're quite quick to track and they're quite good leading indicators, excuse me, of what's happening in your channels.
It's so interesting. There's been, I feel like over the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of discussion around self-reported attribution, and I know that it's been kind of hailed as, the way to uncover the dark social world that we live in, right? And uncover some things that are not easily attributable. And I think it is to a degree. There are some insights in there. I can also tell you that I look at a lot of these, as I'm sure you guys have too, and sometimes it's like the internet, and or I forget, or I don't know, my friend, or this or that, and some stuff that, is interesting, right? But it's not that directional or actionable. And the other thing too about it is good, and I totally agree with you. The other thing to keep in mind is it is one touch point in the journey. Usually, I mean, unless you're marketing to marketers, maybe that marketer's being nice and is like, well, I saw an organic post, and then I heard about something on Slack, and then my friend Emma said that she loves you guys, so here I am, I mean, that would be cool if that happened, but I mean, the majority of people just don't take the time to do that. So again, I think to your point, Ruta, it's a data point. We should look at it. We should understand it. It's an incredibly easy field to put on. This is not some massive implementation. You can put it as optional if you want. How did you hear about us? Done. Make sure it's mapped into your CRM and onwards. And then you can review that on a monthly basis, and that's where you can find insights like, hey, they keep mentioning Reddit over here. We're not organically on there, we're not paid on there, but everyone keeps talking about us on Reddit. What's going on there? And so that might be a really great indicator to say, maybe we're missing the boat. There's a lot of conversations happening about our brand or about the topics or things that we do. We should maybe go investigate that. So that might be another, avenue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan. I think this is our definitely most in-depth episode about PPC ever, which is what we were going for. So I'm very glad. I'm sure, Emma, you agree. Thank you so much for joining us. I wonder if there's anything that we should have asked you that we didn't. And I know that's a big question.
I asked the same thing on my podcast too, and I should have been thinking about this before. I mean, I think the biggest thing is, the biggest takeaway really with all this is really just making sure expectations are set. We already said it, but if there's anything that could be done, I think that a lot of times agencies especially are guilty of over promising and selling this massive vision of what things are going to look like with unrealistic objectives. And this is what usually paints a bad picture for agencies or even consultants that come in and do this. And so I think whether you're the founder, the CEO listening to this, make sure to look for people that are really going to be transparent and authentic and realizing like, hey, this is what's actually possible with the channel, and those that are really thinking about your goals and how your activities on the paid side will map to those. And I think that'd be the biggest thing for me, because most everything is expectations. It's true of everything in life, right? And so, if we are coming to a movie theater, right, and we are so excited for this thing, we think it's going to be the best thing ever, sometimes it doesn't live up to what we thought, right? And so we come out of it saying, it was kind of okay. But if you come in and you say, you know what, I don't know, I'm just going to see how it is, right? Then a lot of times you'll come out happier. And so expectations are the bane of unhappiness sometimes. And so you just have to set those things the right way, which is way easier said than done. It's not easy. But I think that's a good takeaway probably from this whole podcast.
I just also have to set the record straight. Mission Impossible is as good as you think it's going to be.
Perfect.
And that's where we're going to end this conversation.
I love it. Well done.
Jonathan, again, thank you. You've been a fountain of knowledge, I believe is the saying. And we will link what you do, your podcast, your LinkedIn link, and also we're hoping that you will join us on the community. So if anyone has any specific questions they want to ask, bop over to blameitonmarketing.com, join us, and then we're hoping that Jonathan will be in there to help us answer those questions.